200 years. Britain proudly ruled the waves and about a quarter of the world. But the British Empire has shrunk again and again. Now the United Kingdom itself, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, is weaker than at any point in living memory. Tensions have flared in Northern Ireland in the most serious clashes with police for years. And in Scotland, a fierce political battle for independence is in full swing.
Scotland's future must be in Scotland's hands.
The union between England and Scotland goes back over 300 years. But it's under increasing strain. And if Scotland were to go, could it pave the way for Northern Ireland and even Wales to do the same? At this organic farm outside Edinburgh, almost all of the produce is proudly grown in Scotland. And the farm's founder, Mike, thinks Scotland would be better off as an independent country. It's a hot topic right now, as the Scottish National Party have promised to ask Westminster for an independence referendum should they win a majority at the forthcoming election in May.
My partner's family are from Yorkshire and they think Scotland is just another part of England rather than its own country, and also you see politicians do that as well.
They'd be wrong though. Scotland has a long and proud history as an independent nation. The Romans never managed to conquer it, and for much of its history, it was fighting its English neighbours south of the border. England had joined with Wales in 1536. A union with Scotland came about after the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, died in 1603. Her cousin James, who was King of Scotland, took over the English throne. The two countries now shared a king and an army, but had separate parliaments and laws. A few decades later, Scotland tried to set up a colony, New Caledonia, in what is now Panama. It was a disaster, and Scotland was left in serious debt. So when a union with England was proposed, it looked to some like a sensible financial decision, and the Acts of Union were passed by 1707.
Some Scots looked south of the border and thought that it would be good to have a relationship with this much more powerful, richer nation with its bigger market. The Scots could trade with the English colonies in the Caribbean. Scotland then was able to trade in tobacco, and that was the basis of Glasgow's rise in the 18th century.
Ireland was later strong-armed into the Union in 1801, but this was short-lived, as in 1922 the country was split in two, with the Irish Free State becoming independent and Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK. While the opportunities of empire may no longer exist, for members of the Union, being part of the UK still has its advantages. For a start, the UK is still Scotland's main trading partner. 60% of all Scottish exports go to the rest of Britain. That's almost triple what it exports to the rest of the world, excluding Europe. Andy co-runs a brewery outside Edinburgh, and for him, trade with the UK is a compelling reason to stay in the Union.
For us, the market in England has grown in importance. It's very easy to sell across the UK, no limitations in terms of us travelling into England with independence. You will have a land border between England and Scotland, and I could see a much more difficult scenario.
But some have always thought Scotland would be better off standing on its own 2 feet. By the 1960s, a nationalist voice in Scottish politics was gaining ground. The Scottish National Party, or the SNP, who won an important victory in Westminster in 1967. And in the years that followed, the nationalist cause received an unexpected boost: the discovery of oil off the coast of Scotland.
Liquid gold. Britain now has oil, billions and billions of barrels of it, and it's been quietly lapping at the doorstep all the time.
In the 1980s, oil revenue exploded. and many thought Scotland should see more of this money, which added around £193 billion to the UK economy between 1975 and 2020. This was coupled with deindustrialisation in the 1980s under British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She was deeply disliked in Scotland, and this boosted calls for independence. In 1997, Scotland voted in favour of a devolved parliament, which was then created by Tony Blair, Britain's Prime Minister.
Every single area of Scotland, we're all moving forward, and we're moving forward together.
This meant Scotland had its own parliament for the first time in nearly 300 years, and devolution gave Scotland the power to make decisions on areas like agriculture, education and health, known as devolved matters, while UK-wide concerns such as immigration, foreign policy and defence were managed by Westminster and were known as reserved matters. The UK government still provided financial support to Scotland. This was in the form of a block grant, and together with income tax, national insurance payments, and other rates from within Scotland, helped fund the work of the Scottish Parliament. Some unionists say Scotland couldn't survive without this financial support from Westminster, because Scotland raises less tax and spends more per person than the rest of the UK. In 2019, Scotland spent 8.6% more than it earned, compared with 2.6% for the UK overall. But nationalists say if Scotland could control its own economic policies, it could stimulate growth and help close this gap. And some have been fighting hard to prove it.
The establishment of the Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh, it was believed would see the end of nationalism, and that would be enough because Scotland would be legislating on Scottish issues. However, that didn't, because what devolution did was encourage the nationalists and allowed them to ask for more devolution.
In 2011, the SNP won a majority at Holyrood, which gave them a platform to ask for Scottish independence. But the referendum that followed was a disappointment for them. In 2014, Scotland voted to remain in the UK by 55 to 45%. And that seemed to be the end of that. Until 2 years later, and Brexit.
The celebration started in the early hours of this morning. The UK had voted to get out of the EU.
In 2016, the UK voted to leave the EU by 52 to 48%. But this did not reflect the Scottish portion of the vote, where 62% voted to remain. Many Scots felt betrayed. They were being pulled out of the European Union against their will.
I think the Brexit referendum was a turning point in lots of ways, because that massive decision was taken without the consent of people in Scotland, that reinforced this idea that maybe the UK couldn't accommodate Scotland's distinctive wishes as a nation within the United Kingdom.
Back in Edinburgh, this is certainly how Mike feels, as something he never voted for has now brought his small business new paperwork and increased costs.
Brexit at the moment is a disaster. I mean, I've got about 5 different customs agents that I sign up with. A lot of jargon we don't understand. I really cannot see any advantage of Brexit. Whoever I've spoken to has never given me an answer either.
This has helped cement his decision to vote for a party favouring independence at the next election, in the hope that there will be a second Scottish independence referendum.
I've got no faith in Westminster's just proven to be corrupt, as far as I'm concerned. And I just think it's better to be independent and away from that.
Mike's not alone. Support for independence has been rising since 2012. But after the Brexit vote, it overtook support for devolution, or remaining partly governed by Westminster. For nationalists, part of the renewed appeal of leaving the UK is that Scotland could rejoin the EU as an independent nation. But would that mean Scotland would be better off? Possibly not. That's because the border between England and Scotland would become a border between what's left of Britain and the EU. And this could potentially disrupt trade with Scotland's main trading partner. Some business people, like Andy, are worried about what independence might mean for trade with the rest of the UK. Brexit has already complicated things, and he worries that Scottish independence could make things even harder.
I think the only real issue we have recently is just trying to send a box of beer for our online shop to Northern Ireland, which was a right headache. There's obviously now much more constraints on the movement back and forth over the Irish Sea. I think that might put people off to go down the route of the yes vote on Scottish independence.
But even Andy is on the fence about independence, and the finer points of trade and economics may not matter in a debate about national identity. Because, as Brexit showed, the idea of taking back control is very powerful. It is one of the architects of Brexit, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who seems to hold a lot of the cards when it comes to independence. If the SNP were to win a convincing majority at the next Scottish election, then they could ask for another referendum. But they might not be able to hold it. That's because, as the UK government sees it, the law is clear, and the British Prime Minister has to grant permission for a referendum. But Mr. Johnson has made it clear he has no intention of doing this. Whether the Scottish Parliament has the legal right to organise a referendum without Westminster's permission is a question that has never been tested in court.
One option may be to just go ahead anyway to try to hold a referendum. And so then what? Then you may be into a situation that Catalonia found itself in, where it pushed ahead with a referendum that was not seen to be within the legal order of the Spanish Constitution. So you have stalemate.
Whatever happens, the other devolved nations will be watching keenly. There are calls in Wales for more devolution. And Northern Ireland has the possibility for a referendum on reunification with Ireland, built into the Good Friday Agreement.
We are seeing clear tensions emerging within Northern Ireland linked to the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol that was part of the UK-EU withdrawal agreement. The issue in Northern Ireland is not about independence, it's about reunification with the island of Ireland. Now that may be some way off, but that's a distinctive issue related also to some of the consequences of Brexit.
Everyone in this debate hopes that if any of the nations of the United Kingdom do break away, it will be done in a peaceful and orderly way that minimises damage to the economy. But such a neat divorce would have few precedents. In the 20th century, the breakup of countries usually followed economic chaos, decolonisation, or war. The increasing calls for independence could be the most important thing Westminster has to manage over the coming years. While a breakup of the UK seemed highly unlikely until recently, it's now possible that Scotland could lead the charge.
I'm Matthew Hollis, the Britain political correspondent at The Economist. For more about the United Kingdom, Brexit, and Scotland's future in Europe, you can read the newspaper's briefing by clicking the link. Thank you for watching.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our short class. So before I forget, let's do the smart attendance. And your smart attendance number is 463. 463 is your smart attendance number, 463. And so let me go back to the class here and put that in the chat, 463. And everybody's got that now. And we're continuing to talk about parties, political parties. And again, I've always have this desire to put in context the material that you're reading in the broader perspective of political life and political behavior and political science. And the focus on parties, it can be understood in terms of the focus on interest groups forming a political party in order to achieve political power by achieving control over the government. So that's one way to talk about political parties as extensions of interest groups. That when interest groups decide that they want to run candidates for office in democracies and win those elections and take control of the offices, the government, that interest group, when an interest group decides to form a political organization that's focused on winning elections, that interest group becomes a party, a political party. So we need to think a little bit more about interest groups. And as we covered the last class, forming interest groups is a way by which you and I as individuals can have more influence in the political system, because individuals alone, typically voting is not a very individually powerful way about having an influence over elections, right? We vote because we should, we vote because we want to have our voices heard. But if you really want to generate influence over the minds and actions of government officials, over the minds and actions of bureaucrats and civil servants in the government, these are people that are not elected, but they're still very important parts of the government, obviously, then we need to form interest groups. And forming interest groups has many different motivations. People have many different motivations for participating in politics. And so they have many different motivations for forming interest groups. And interest groups, of course, include many different motivations, including, of course, money. Interest groups that are lobbying politicians and government officials on behalf of industries and economic sectors. That's often what we think about when we think about interest groups. We think about interest groups often as economically motivated, and that often is true. I mean, 80% of our social interaction as human beings is economic, and so it's not surprising that that companies form interest groups, businesses form interest groups, farmers form interest groups, workers form trade unions, which is an economic interest group, right? They want to pressure and lobby the government and the bureaucrats on behalf of the interests of their individual trade union members as workers. And the Labour Party in Great Britain, for example, is a political party that emerged out of the trade union interest group social movement in Great Britain that decided that it needed to win elections to better the conditions of their members through affecting and shaping and determining government policy. So they formed the Labour Party, which has been one of the two dominant parties in Great Britain for over 100 years. And so interest groups have a lot of different motivations, and interest groups are important, but there's other motivations for forming interest groups. And those motivations can include pressuring for the interests of national self-determination, or forming an interest group to pressure and lobby a government to defend the interests of minority groups, like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the United States is one of the major interest groups lobbying and pressuring the government to work to improve the conditions of African Americans in the United States. And you can find such examples of identity-based interest groups in Europe as well. And these interests that motivate people to form interest groups and political parties include nationalism, and they might form a new party if you're a Scottish nationalist with the aim of gaining control over government power in order to work towards your objective of autonomy and maybe even independence of Scotland from the United Kingdom. And if you decide to work through the electoral process, you are going to form a political party. And so there are lots of different motivations for forming political parties, just like there are lots of different motivations for forming interest groups. It's just that political parties typically are bigger than interest groups. They're much bigger than interest groups because they have to win elections. And so when political parties form, they bring together a number of different interest groups. In the American system, we have two main parties, and one the Republican Party and one the Democratic Party. And so you can imagine that these parties each have a tremendous number of different interest groups and constituencies within them that are working together to win elections. And that means that these political parties have to, the leaderships of these political parties have to reconcile and coordinate these different interest groups within them and the demands that they have. And so a political party and a political party's position or platform, or what it publicly states it wants the government to do, is going to have to balance all of these different pressures from these different interest groups. That involves compromise and negotiation amongst the interest groups, which requires that these interest groups often have to modify or reduce their demands to continue to support the political party, because they all know what we're discussing here. That if we want to take control of the government, we have to win elections, which means we have to appeal to millions of voters, more than the other party is appealing to, which means we have to accommodate lots of different pressures. And that means compromise, and people often don't like too much compromise, particularly when it comes to issues, for example, regarding nationalism. Because nationalism is an intense identity issue. It's about who I am, who you are. And for me to compromise on who I am is a very sensitive and emotional topic. I can compromise and do business deals regarding business, regarding economic interests, because that's what economics and business is all about. I'm giving you something that you want, money, in return for something that I want, maybe to buy a new mask. And so I give you something I value, and I get something that I also value. But to compromise regarding identity and the expression of identity in the form of group self-determination, that is likely to generate more intense emotions. But it generates intense emotions, but it also is a powerful motivation, because it is an issue of who I am, and I do not want to surrender my identity typically only for economic benefits. Look, like we talked about in class previously, right? I have many different identities. I have many different interest groups, let's call them in-groups, self-identity groups that I belong to. I'm the member of the interest group Guy Dominiches. I'm a member of the identity interest group American. I'm a member of the identity interest group Ohioan. I'm a member of the identity interest group White Man. I'm a member of the identity interest group Catholic Church. And I can go on and on and on and describe all these different identity interest groups that I have. Some are more important to me than others. Like my Ohio identity is very minor level of importance to me. But my family identity and the well-being of my family identity interest group, D. Dominices, that's typically much more important for me, to the point that I would be willing to sacrifice lots of material benefit or well-being for myself to protect the well-being of my brothers and sisters, right? We do this all the time, right? Parents and family members make sacrifices to protect the well-being of their families, right? And we also are willing to do that for our nations, And so, so identity is a very powerful motivation. And during a time of crisis, identity drives can overcome material interests. So that's the question. How powerful is nationalist identity? And I also want to bring back this notion of motivated reasoning that I talked about in the previous class. If I'm an intense nationalist and I desperately am proud of being Scottish, and I want Scotland to be equal and sovereign to all the other nations of Europe, that means becoming independent from the United Kingdom and having my own state that is sovereign and recognized by England, Germany, France, Estonia, Latvia, United States, all of them. Then if that is so powerful for me, I will probably try to convince myself that if Scotland leaves the United Kingdom and joins that it will not suffer in the long term economically. So we talked about this before, about how it's human nature for human beings to see a world, including the future and the past, as well as today, in a way that is self-serving, in a way in which there is no conflict between my desire for wealth, because I do want money, I do want economic well-being and prosperity and pride and progress and power for my people. And I also want self-determination in the form of a sovereign state. And so I will convince myself that there's no conflict, ultimate conflict between those two. And you saw this, for example, in the Brexit campaign, in the campaign for independence, for exit from the European Union by British Leave campaign supporters to leave the European Union. They were convincing themselves and everyone else that they could, in terms of trying to win the referendum successfully in June 2016, that if Britain leaves the European Union, Britain's economy will be much better than it will be within the European Union. Maybe not today, maybe not even tomorrow, but in the long term, Britain will be better off economically. And they'll make themselves believe that. And so if you're an intense Scottish nationalist, you will tend to do the same thing. And we talked about this very briefly, and I didn't really show the literature that focuses on this, but there's a long tradition of research in the area of social psychology about this tendency towards what's called motivated reasoning. And some of the founders of this are Leon Festinger. This is in the field of social psychology, that human beings try to avoid cognitive dissonance, that there is no conflict in my thinking between Scotland becoming independent and Scottish economic well-being, or Britain leaving the European Union and Britain's long-term economic well-being. And I'll make myself believe that there's not a conflict, and I will find some people or some experts with PhD after their name that will tell me or say to me what I want to hear. And I will point to that person and say, see, that expert says Britain will be better off in the long term economically if we leave the European Union. To avoid cognitive dissonance, in the field of psychology, it says here, cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds contradictory beliefs, values, and ideas, and is typically experiences psychological stress. And so I will try to get rid of that stress by making myself believe that there's not a conflict between my values. Other thinkers that have described this aspects of this process include, let's see if I can find the link here. Fritz Heider is another one in his social psychology book, The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, how we tend to see the world of our friends and enemies, our adversaries and our allies individually, because he's not a political scientist, he's a social psychologist, right? In ways that make sense, that we avoid cognitive dissonance, basically. So, this notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, That's the psychology of interpersonal relations. We tend to engage in balancing and see the world in ways that there is, that we avoid the stress of accepting, of believing that there's a conflict between what I want. I want to see a world around me in which there's no conflict among my many different motivations and values, including my identity values, my material economic values, and so on. And so as we think about political parties and Euroscepticism in the European Union, the reason why, of course, this has come up is because now we're having the first elections in Great Britain since the late 2019, when Boris Johnson won election for the Conservative Party and took control over the British government, and with the slogan to get Brexit done. After almost 3.5 years since the Brexit vote, Britain was still not out of the European Union. So the elections happened in December 2019. He wins in a tremendous victory, great majority over the Labour Party at the time, the main opposition party, and now with the pandemic and the lockdowns, now today I think we're having in Britain the first elections for local and regional parliaments and local councils. It's not a national election for the British National Parliament. It's not that election. It's the election for local governments and councils, city councils, and the regional parliament in Scotland is also having an election to elect members to the regional parliament in Scotland at Holyrood. It's called Holyrood because I think it's located in a place called Holyrood. So they're expecting that the Scottish National Party, the party committed to Scottish sovereignty, is likely going to do very well. The question is, will it be able to win a majority of the seats to control the Scottish Parliament? Because there are other parties in the Scottish Parliament as well. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party have members there, and there are other parties as well. And maybe the Scottish National Party might not get an outright majority, but there are other smaller parties that are pro-independence for Scotland that it could form a coalition. The Scottish National Party will be the largest party, and it might form a coalition with smaller parties. Whether the Scottish Nationalist Party wins an outright majority or is forced to enter a coalition with the pro-independent Scottish Greens, it's another party in the Scottish Parliament, posted was still unclear. But the numbers are less important in the direction, which is expected to be emphatically behind a new campaign for Scottish independence. So as was highlighted already in that video that I used to show the introduction to the class, they already had a referendum in Scotland in 2014 on whether or not to leave the European Union, and it failed. And it failed by a vote of 55% against leaving, 44% in favor of leaving the United Kingdom. And in that campaign in 2014, the advocates for Scotland to leave the United Kingdom included references that if Scotland left the United Kingdom, that Scotland would be able to join the European Union and would benefit as a small country like the other small countries of the European Union from the European Union. I mean, Estonia's got a few million people, Latvia's got a few million people. There are many countries that are about the size of Scotland in terms of their population size. The Baltic states, Croatia, they're much smaller countries than Scotland that are members of the European Union. And they assumed, of course, the advocates led by the Scottish National Party and Alexander Salmond, you saw him referenced in that introductory talk, that, oh, obviously Scotland would be able to join the European Union. And the European Union, because it's concerned about not destabilizing its member states, or being seen to be encouraging the destabilization of the constitutional order of the member states, reminded the Scottish nationalists that if they succeeded in becoming independent from the United Kingdom, they would have to go through the accession process to join the United Kingdom, just like all the new member states have to go through the accession process, which could take years. They can't just assume that they're going to get in right after leaving the United Kingdom, but they can enter the European Union immediately. But the Scottish nationalists obviously wanted to believe that there was not an intense conflict between Scotland's economic well-being and Scottish self-determination in that process of motivated reasoning to avoid cognitive dissonance that I was referencing previously. So this is under discussion now. Here it's summarizing some of the points I just made. Boris Johnson, who's leading the Conservative Party in Great Britain, has said that he will not agree to another referendum in Scotland. And Scotland had more than one referendum. Scotland has had other referendums before the 2014 referendum on whether or not to leave the United Kingdom. And he's saying that he will not agree to another one. The matter is settled. Of course, the Scottish nationalists say, well, of course, we didn't expect that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union when we had our 2014 referendum. And so we have the right to another referendum. And polls now put the split at roughly 50-50 in terms of public opinion surveys in Scotland about supporting independence. And, you know, that's what it was. I recall, because I've been here at the Catholic University of Korea since 2009. And of course, I was teaching classes when the Scots had their 2014 referendum. And we saw similar poll reports about split 50-50 in terms of whether or not to leave or stay in the United Kingdom. You would see fluctuations during the campaign of plus or minus 1, 2, or 3%. At times it looked like the pro-leave United Kingdom Scottish nationalists were going to win according to public opinion surveys. And then we had the election and people were generally shocked about this outcome. 55-44, that's not close. That's 11 points difference. And the public opinion polls leading up to the election, to the referendum in 2014, did not indicate it would be this close. And so in some ways it was similar to the Brexit vote in 2016, right? That many people generally assumed that the Brexit vote would fail and Britain would not leave the European Union, would not vote to leave the European Union, and they turned out to be wrong. But I think that and of course, Boris Johnson is doing better in the public opinion polls, the leader of the British government of the Conservative Party, because he is taking credit for the rapid vaccination campaign in the United Kingdom. And but this is the reason for the existence of the Scottish National Party. It's always been its reasons for this party's existence. You can have different motivations for different parties. And so maybe at this point, let's do a survey because I've done a lot of talking. So please respond to the following statements. Scotland will eventually leave the United Kingdom to join the European Union. Do you strongly agree? Agree? Neutral, cannot decide. Disagree? Strongly disagree. So let me stop the share. Well, I don't think I need to stop the share. Maybe I can just go to, well, I stopped it anyway. Let me go to the vote here. And here we go. And so I have to stop the share and then redo the share to get back to the vote. So please vote on whether or not you think Scotland will eventually leave the United Kingdom to join the European Union. And let's just spend 1 minute on that. You have 1 minute starting now. Please vote. 50 seconds. Thirty seconds. $20 seconds. 10 seconds. Okay, so the final result is that you believe that most of you do not believe that Scotland is going to leave the United Kingdom. And, you know, quite honestly, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think I would also disagree. Maybe even, you know, at least disagree. Because another part of that tradition regarding regarding the cognitive dissonance and psychological balancing and avoiding cognitive dissonance is a basis in subconscious, that there are things happening in our minds, in our brains, that we're not consciously aware of. And Sigmund Freud has influenced people like Fritz Heider and Leon Festinger. Were strongly influenced by Sigmund Freud's theories, including this notion of subconscious, that there are things happening in my mind, in my brain, that I'm not aware of, that shape and determine how I see or understand my friends, my family, my existence, my business, my other people I interact with. You know, going back to Sigmund Freud, and he was this one that developed this notion of subconscious. And I think that refers to this motivated reasoning as well, that people don't admit, because we want to be liked, we want to be understood to be people that are not governed by our emotions, but by our cognitive thinking processes. And so people don't admit that they engage in motivated reasoning, because that's not considered legitimate. You're not supposed to already have your conclusions that you want to believe in mind, that determine how you argue or how you think or how you analyze the situation. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to analyze the situation first and then draw from that analysis the conclusions about what is possible and what is feasible and what is likely or not likely. But when people engage in motivated reasoning, they don't admit that they engage in motivated reasoning. They don't admit it to you, and they don't admit it to themselves, right? And that draws from this notion that there are ways we understand and think about the world that we're not aware of in our own thinking, in our own minds. And, you know, when you think about it, that's pretty obvious, right? We know that, you know, certain people are born predisposed towards, for example, being depressed or depression. And depressed people understand the world around them, including their assumption regarding the motivations of other people that they encounter in their lives in different ways from somebody who's not suffering from depression. And depression can be a biological biological factor that people inherit from genetic material, right? So we sort of understand this, but so this goes back to this notion of how do you know how do you know what people actually do believe, or what really are their motivations? And you can determine what their motivations are typically when they have to make a difficult choice. Like I think I talked briefly about this at the last class. That let's see if I can find it here, because I thought I had this ready to go and I moved things around a bit. So let me call up the class material here. And yeah, how do you know what people's motivations and drives really are? And what you can look at, what do they choose to do when they are confronted with a difficult situation? When they're confronted with a difficult situation. So let me see if I can find this here. 1 second. When they have to make a difficult choice, right? When people have to make a difficult choice, so you can see here, how intensely do I self-identify with an in-group, with one of my interest in-groups, Dita Minichez, Catholic Church, Ohio, America, white man, whatever. When I have to make a difficult choice, whatever way I decide in terms of making a choice, I'm going to give up something else that I value. And so someone might tell you in a public opinion survey, and they might really believe that they support Scottish independence. So let's assume some young, attractive, smart college student comes up to me and asks me my opinion about whether or not I support Brexit, or whether or not I support Scottish independence. And I might really say, yes, I support Scottish independence. But then what do I do? What do I do when I go into a voting booth and close the curtains so nobody can see, and I have to choose either to push the button to support Scottish independence or push the button against Scottish independence? And a lot of those people who were saying that they were going to support Scottish independence, when they actually went into a voting booth and had to vote, they didn't vote for Scottish independence because it's going to be costly. it's going to be disruptive. It certainly will be disruptive if Scotland attempts to leave the United Kingdom. I mean, the United Kingdom would disintegrate, and then the border between Scotland and England would become the border between the European Union and England. And that means all the border controls and checks that go on between European Union and non-European Union states would apply. Scotland's economy is overwhelmingly intertwined with England, with the rest of the Great Britain. Aside from the economy, there's a tremendous amount of intermarriage between people on the border areas between Scotland and England. You can't even find the border. It's not even marked, typically, in many places in Britain between Scotland and England. And so I can dream and believe, yeah, proud of Scotland. I love Braveheart. I love Scottish football teams. Go Glasgow. Yeah, I think Scotland's being abused by the English. And then I go into the voting booth and I have to vote. And you find that when people have to make a difficult choice, they surprise even themselves sometimes, their difficult choices, the choice that they actually make. Not because they're lying, devious people, they themselves are not aware of what is really their deepest motivations, often. And that goes back to that social psychology and psychoanalytic tradition that I was highlighting previously. So, and you know, a nationalist is somebody who's willing to risk their career, sacrifice their career, risk their life for the well-being and sovereignty of Korea or China or Germany or United States, or pick your nation, whatever. But you know, I might just be a little bit upset about the fact that, you know, the English don't treat Scotland with enough respect. So I sacrifice peace of mind, but that's a lot less than willing to sacrifice my career, right? So that's fourth level intensity. You know, I think Scottish nationalism is pretty much, a lot of it is here, as well as maybe some here, but that's about it. Sacrifice material wealth to the point it affects your lifestyle. That's, you know, and there are a lot of people who do. A lot of people, for example, that support Albanian independence from Serbia in the Kosovo War. They were living and working in Switzerland or other countries in Europe and sending a lot of their money that they were making back to Kosovo and supporting the Kosovo Liberation Army. So that's an indicator. I mean, that you could save that money, keep that money, and use it to buy things for yourself. But when you can't buy a nice apartment because you're sending money home to support the Kosovo Liberation Army that's fighting the Serbs, that's an indicator about how intense your commitment to that in-group identity, interest in-group is. So let's go back and talk about the notes, because we should talk about the notes that you were reading in terms of interest political parties. And I think those are the notes, and let's see if I can find it here, because, okay, so, and of course, so these political parties, they exist. Many of them very old. I already mentioned how the Labour Party is over 100 years old, at least since the 19th century, right? That party has been around. The Conservative Party, it's been around for centuries. And they consist of alliances and constellations of political interest groups within them, focused on winning elections as political parties. But of course, England or Germany or Italy or France, the internal political motivations and drives of the many different types of interest groups within France or Italy or Germany change and develop and evolve over time and over the years and over the generations. As Italy becomes more developed, as Italy becomes more prosperous, or any country, its different groups rise and fall within it politically, and they are participating in politics, and they're participating in political parties. So we see, when you're reading the chapter 14, or you've been reading that chapter, this chapter is about how political parties have adapted to the rise within them, particularly of Euroscepticism, that had not really been there before. So, but became more and more powerful, more and more influential within the Conservative Party, or within all of the parties of pretty much all of the major parties, let's say the major parties within Europe, with the rise of nationalism which of course reflects also the increasing pace and acceleration of European integration to go beyond forming the common single market to creating the European Parliament and European Parliament elections and so on. Also with the decline and end of the Cold War as a motivating factor that would push people to ally with each other because of the perceived common threat from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is gone. And of course, we've talked about the danger of how maybe that might be replaced by looking for a new enemy, because if we have a common enemy, it's easier for us to do politics with each other, to compromise and negotiate if we like each other, because again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so if we all see a threat from China, it'll be easier for the Social Democrats and the Greens and the Conservative Party in Germany, for example, to cooperate. Even the Alternative for Germany, if they see a threat from communist China, that they might be more willing to cooperate with the other parties. So there's a danger, there's a functional danger there. But again, it goes back to human nature. And so there are a lot of different motivations for engaging in interest group behavior, and therefore engaging in political party behavior and political party politics. And so the chapter is about the rise of Euroscepticism within these parties. Most of these parties already were established. So so the introduction to the notes continues by describing how the process of the politicization of political parties in the EU member states has not been an even or gradual one. That until the early 1990s, until the end of the Cold War, the European Union was not a big topic of political discussion or conflict within these countries. And so it was not a big issue or discussion of conflict within the political parties. There was what Professor Taggart calls the permissive consensus, that all of the major parties within the European Union member states, of course, much smaller at the beginning, through the 1950s into the 60s and 70s, 1970s, there was a permissive consensus that European integration, economic integration should proceed. And then political parties have been driving the politics of Europeanization, and political parties therefore politicize European integration issues, because politicians want to win elections, and if some group of politicians leading political parties view Euroscepticism as a way by which to win more votes, they will exploit that. There will be someone in the political system who will exploit an emerging perception of collective challenge or threat to national sovereignty from European integration. Somebody will be there to exploit that. And if you're Emmanuel Macron, even if you support European integration, you are a skilled politician, and you know that you have to respond to that rising Euroscepticism, partly by speaking in more Eurosceptic terms yourself, but also at least forming coalitions and new allies and alliances within France to counteract the rise of Euroscepticism, because Emmanuel Macron is not going to label himself a Eurosceptic. And people know that. They will find someone to vote for if they are really intensely committed to French sovereignty and see the European Union as a threat to French sovereignty. They'll find somebody who expresses that intense commitment to French sovereignty and hostility to further European integration. So let me see here. So early in the study of European integration, the impact of domestic politics was not emphasized, because it was European integration was in a technocratic, business, market-oriented process, and then later, of course, not coincidentally, after the Cold War has ended, we start seeing more of a focus on what is going on inside the member states to explain what the impact of the European Union is in terms of European integration. That first off, there's no one single impact on European parties from European integration. That European parties respond and react to European integration depending upon their national political characteristics and the national characteristics that are unique to Britain or France or Germany or Italy or Portugal or Greece or any of them. They do respond to European integration, but they respond differently. And so that means if we want to understand the impact of European integration on political parties, we have to, again, become acquainted with and experts in the features of British politics and the features and attitudes and values and perceptions that that prevail on an interest group, a collective group level within Britain or within Germany. And that means understanding histories, understanding perceptions of histories, and so on. So that prevail in those different countries. So this focus on the domestic level, domestic politics on the European Union, and therefore the role of political parties in European integration really got a big boost into the 21st century. And this is the dominant, not the only one, but this has been the big focus about understanding how European integration moves forward now. We already talked about liberal intergovernmentalism, and that means that the member states drive this process. And it's pretty blatant, obviously, right now in terms of dealing with the crises of the last 15 years, first with the sovereign debt crisis and now with the pandemic. Again, you see the European Council meeting and not even bothering with referendums and treaty modifications that have to be approved, just doing it in terms of the member states, often with this view that we have to do this in order to save the European integration project and maybe even therefore to save democracy in Europe, because if they can't cooperate, and that's what liberalism is all about, cooperation, right? Then they have to compete. And if they have to compete, there's strong incentives build for that competition to intensify to unhealthy levels, as we saw in European history up until 1945. And this has become even stronger focus now in the post-functionalist approach to understanding how political integration is constrained and shaped by grassroots, mass public political behavior. And that means as expressed through political parties. So we're running out of time here. So we already talked about the permissive consensus, how and that began to change when we started to see European crises become more common, particularly in the last, since 2008. So that's 15 years, right? And then the need to respond to these sovereign debt crises, for example, in Greece and in particular, but also in Cyprus and Spain and Ireland and Portugal, by the European Union having to come up with funds, and that means mostly Germany, and that means asking the German voters to tolerate or persuading the German voters as a whole to accept that. And of course, you're going to have Eurosceptic parties emerge in response to that, with all the stereotyping that surrounds this Euroscepticism. That why should we hardworking Germans, subsidize those corrupt, lazy Greeks who, all the ugly stereotypes come up that you don't hear within a national sovereign nation state, right? I mean, I don't think people here in Gyeonggi-do province in South Korea criticize people in Jeju for not being hardworking enough when money is taken from taxes collected in the Seoul area and sent to the poor areas of South Korea. You don't think that's wrong because you're all Koreans. You don't even think about it. But people still think about this in Europe, that why should we hardworking Germans subsidize those lazy, corrupt Greeks who can't, got themselves in this trouble? And that's because national identities are still prominent. And again, it's expressed through political parties. And now with the migration crisis, also, again, the hostility in response to migration, which is seen as somehow often by those nationalists as facilitated and encouraged by European integration, that we're encouraging people to come to Europe because they once they cross one border anywhere in Europe, they can go elsewhere relatively easily, so to speak. That European integration is scapegoated as responsible for that. And of course, that manifests itself in the rise of new political parties or existing parties that are Eurosceptic, pivot and exploit the new issue of conflict that they can use to express their opposition to threats to German sovereignty. So for example, this Alternative for Germany party, this emerged not with the migration crisis, it first emerged with regard to rejecting the German support for the economic bailout of Greece. And that sort of faded as an issue. And then and so the Alternative for Germany as a political party that has professional politicians within it, that have ambitious individuals who seek power and seek to win elections, pivoted to a new major issue, or emphasize migration into Germany. And that's their main focus now. Now they're focusing on the pandemic shutdown and the pandemic issues. And so we only have about 5 minutes left here. So of course we should go back to the debate topic and do our debate. So let me divide you up into two groups. And the person at the top of the list will be the person who's going to speak for that group. And so open all rooms. And so please join the groups there and tell me what your group's position is onto whether or not one country, at least one country, will eventually leave the European Union. That was the debate topic. So please join those groups. And it says Pak Subin. Are you there, Pak Subin? So I'll assign you group 2 and Sok Ju-yun. And so please join the groups and come up with a group position on whether or not you think another country will do a Brexit, will leave the European Union. So you wrote your paragraphs. So we don't have any much time to waste here, so I'm not going to waste time waiting for people to join if they're not joined. So Song Hyun you are going to speak for group 1, and In Hyuk Chun, you'll speak for group 2, room 2. And we just have 2 minutes, so come up with a position. And Song Hun for group 1 and In Hyuk Chun for group 2. Come up with a position statement on whether or not you think one additional country will leave the European Union. And let's see if I can go back to that. Yeah, to South Koreans, at least one additional country will eventually leave the European Union. That was the debate topic. So please prepare your positions, Song Hyun and In Hyuk Chun. And we'll do that for 1 minute. So since Song Hyun is all by himself, I will close the rooms and give you 60 seconds. Do you think one more country will leave, at least one more country will leave the European Union? Thirty seconds. Twenty seconds. 10 seconds. Okay, so let me ask who's going to speak first. So tails, it's Song Hyun and it is heads. So In Hyuk Chun. In Hyuk Chun, what did your group come up with?
We decide our opinion is con because the UK has a potential force to keep the relationship with other country. I mean, our country, but the the another European states, I think they didn't have the potential force to stay relationship with other country because their language or culture because it's so different. And so the Brexit is, yeah, that's opinion.
Okay,
Sorry,
and
time is
Song Hun what did your group come up with?
So we were on side of the pros because they were like we didn't have much time to talk about it, but
Right, yeah.
for me there are like two main reasons. Is that the one of the most important reasons for the existence of European Union is that it kind of helps develop it helps countries to develop their economic situation. And since the globalization has like moving very fastly, so like just staying in the European Union won't help the member states so much, so that they will have to like work with countries other than the member states. And I would say that it is possible for another country to leave the European Union because the United Kingdom has set a example for the other member states that like one of the countries could leave the European Union and still be successful.
Okay, so I'm sorry, it's one of our, short classes here, so, it's hard to do so much in one class. So let's go back to and vote on whether or not, on your view here. And so please vote on this topic. And so I see some of you already voted. And so we're already over time. And so we'll just do this 30 seconds. Ten seconds. Five seconds. Yeah, I mean, I think I pointed out in my comments, right, that I think that it would have to be basically, in terms of scenarios for you to imagine a country leaving the European Union, it would have to first require that the Alternative for Germany party come to power in Germany. And, it's the third biggest party in the German parliament today. And there'll be elections next, I think, this year in September. So it would really require a new kind of political authority to come to power in Germany for me to imagine, because we saw how the Germans were willing to put out 300 billion euros to support Greece. Right? I mean, it's not like as if they just gave the money to Greece, but they put up 300 billion euros to support the Greece staying in the European Union and the Eurozone in the European Union. So I don't know why they would stop doing that if another country entered an economic crisis. But that's it for today. Does anybody have any questions? If not, I'm going to end the meeting, okay? Bye.